Greetings, Mandrake Road family. We pick up our journey through the Gospel of Mark again this week, and we will begin in chapter 1, verse 16, and we'll read this text later in our Facebook Live video. And I encourage you to read it before we have our Facebook Live video on Thursday. This gets us full on into the story. We talked about the prologue and this kind of transition statement in 1 through 15. But this gets us full on into the narrative of Jesus' ministry and Jesus' journey towards what will ultimately be the cross, towards Jerusalem and to the cross. And there are a couple of things that we'll talk about today that are going to be built upon as we go through, and two themes that the Gospel of Mark outlines here and introduces here, and we'll look at those, and we'll come back to them time and time again as we continue through the Gospel of Mark. So in this text, first thing we have is the beginning of Jesus' ministry is after he's preached the kingdom of heaven is, repent for the kingdom of heaven is near, as we see in verses 14 and 15, is we see he calls his first disciples, and he walks up, they're fishing, and he's walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee and says, "Follow me." And also to the first call is I will make you fishers of men, or fishers of people. And we see that, and that's something that has been something you'll see on bumper stickers and Hobby Lobby wall art, things like that. Probably more than a few wall banners and scrolls and things you'll see with that on them, and that's it's a very memorable verse, and it comes in this context that he's calling his disciples, his first disciples. And after he calls and so what we see there is we see that they leave their normal jobs immediately to follow him. There's this sense of urgency in the Gospel of Mark that I have talked about, and we see that here. They completely leave their jobs, their families, and they join Jesus. And in the case of the second calling, you see that the sons of Zebedee leave the family business and leave their dad on the boat. Yeah, so it's a really striking image, and it kind of shows that the immediacy of what is happening in the Gospel of Mark. And after they're called, they go immediately to Capernaum, where they enter the synagogue and Jesus is teaching, and he's one who's teaching with authority, and the crowds, the people there are amazed, and this is a theme we'll see, and we'll talk about this, but it's not the themes we're driving towards. And we have this, a man enters the synagogue who who has an unclean spirit, and we usually call these demons. That's a perfectly acceptable term. And he has an unclean spirit, and Jesus, the spirit, the unclean spirit, recognizes Jesus and says, "We know who you are. What do you want with us, the Holy One of God?" And we see here there's two themes that come out of this. One, this introduces introduces the theme of conflict or opposition that Jesus will experience. So there are two aspects of this, but this is the first one, these kind of supernatural cosmic forces, an unclean spirit. And they know who Jesus is. And then he says, he rebukes the spirit and tells the spirit to come out of the man, and tells it to be quiet. and this introduces another major theme, what we call the messianic secret. And we're not going to unpack that just yet. We're not going to unpack both of these too much in this video and in our Facebook Live video. But this is important. These are two major themes that are going to be built upon throughout the narrative. The conflict opposition theme is going to show up in another aspect in the next text series of texts that we look at next week. But it's not the supernatural cosmic forces, it's the religious authorities. And not only does the messianic secret include these supernatural cosmic forces, but also in speaking to religious authorities. And we'll talk about why that's important, but we're not going to unpack and answer those questions now. I want this to unfold as Mark unfolds, and as we go through this journey of going through Mark's narrative. And so after this scene, okay, they go to the next thing is they leave and they go to we find that Jesus is in Peter's house, and Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, and he does through physical touch. And we're going to talk a little bit about this here in a moment, because there's another healing story that involves the same thing. But this is important. Jesus touching a sick woman and then later a leprous man, that is important. And so one thing is, if you ever wondered if any of the 12 were married, we know for sure that Peter was. He has a mother-in-law. So wherever Peter's wife is, that's another question. But what we see here in Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law, in touching her, that's taboo. That's a cultural thing and a religious thing that you don't touch sick people. You don't, so we introduce this that Jesus is doing very different things here and than what is acceptable. And he's calling people with normal day jobs to follow him. Rabbinic students were sought out a rabbi at this time, and people who were sick, you stayed away from them. You didn't want to be ritually unclean, and well, germs. And so we see Jesus breaking some very different norms of what life looks like in the first century, and regular practice of Jews at the time. And so after he heals them, we see many come to him and they're healed. They have unclean spirits cast out, all of that. And that's a very common, these kind of summary statements. We'll see some of those. But what we see is that later we see this kind of reversal where he went to seek them. In the morning he gets up and he's gone, and his new followers, his disciples, seek him and say, there are people looking for you. And he says, okay, let's go. And so they leave, and he preaches and teaches in synagogues, driving out demons. And so we see another very similar summary statement. But it comes down to, in verse 40, the scene where he heals a man with leprosy. He does so by touch. And again, this is taboo. You don't touch someone with leprosy. And it's to the degree that in first century Israel, people with leprosy or other skin diseases and things like that were not allowed to even be inside the city gates. So something we're seeing is that more than likely Jesus is not in a populated area. He's somewhere outside of a city. And so what we see here is that once he tells the man to go and present himself to the priests and make a sacrifice according to Moses, the law of Moses. And this is something that he doesn't do. He goes into the city and starts proclaiming what was done for him. And so people come out to him. It says come out to the countryside. Now, that's kind of a strange way of thinking about it. The term can mean wilderness as well, or desert, or whatever. And so what we see is that Jesus goes to a place where people with leprosy are, a place of sickness and death. And that person who's healed goes into the city, and people come to him where he's still out in this place of death and sickness. And they come to him to experience life. So there's a reversal there. There's something different. And life outside of what would be life is teeming where life usually doesn't teem, according to what we know from first century Israel and their practices. And so this provides a very interesting snapshot. And now that he's said, present yourself to the priests, we're now setting up what we're going to see once in chapter 2 verse 1 through chapter 3 verse 6. The theme of opposition and conflict that Jesus has with the religious authorities. And so this is foreshadowing that. It's showing us that this is coming up. And it's going to be a major part of the story. And so those are the things I want us to think about, is what we're seeing happening in this text. And we'll talk about the significance of many of these things in our Facebook Live video and what they mean for us today. And so I invite you to come join us. It'll be tomorrow night, Thursday night at 8:30. And I invite you to join us, and I hope we'll have a enjoyable conversation and discussion about Mark as we continue our journey. Thank you.